Public Submission Address to the National Public Dialogue by Stephen Waite. So, I think the crisis being addressed by the National Dialogue can be framed in two different ways, but you could frame it as an identity crisis. And, does South Africa does it want to have an identity that includes the rule of law and having an open liberal society that is guaranteed by the Constitution? Or does it want to just have some kind of ethno-nationalist essence fundamentally? That's the sort of binary choice in terms of identity. But I think another way to classify the crisis in general is that we are living through a constitutional crisis that has been imposed on South Africans by corrupt constitutional and other court judges who have ideologically corrupted and racialized the law in an unconstitutional manner. And so we have a crisis, a constitutional crisis centered in non-racialism, a crisis of non-racialism. Because what we de facto have with racialist legislation in the admissions policies of universities and in the employment quotas that are imposed on the private sector, and how those kinds of quotas are encouraged. Getting the private sector to discriminate on the basis of race, that kind of imposition of racialist decision-making that fundamentally disrupts meritocracy, and it fundamentally disrupts freedom of association, and in some essences a kind of freedom of conscience to actually have a free executive function in the private sector that isn't ideologically filtered by the state. So what I'm effectively saying is that we have not only a racial caste system imposed on society, but we have an ideological racial consciousness that is being radiated by the racialization of law, which is also unconstitutional. So we have lost the first generation right to not be discriminated against. We have lost the first generation value of non-racialism that could be protecting meritocracy within society and keeping all standards where they should be, so that we have institutions with high standards that are not penetrated by a racial caste system that imposes quotas on candidates looking for admission to universities or employment. And so we end up having different standards based on racial segregation, complete independent standards based on racial segregation. And this deprivation of meritocracy then has to be justified or seen as necessary in some way. And the only way that it can be seen as necessary is if you will take people who are chosen in their racial quota system to be symbolic recipients on behalf of the entire group, to be recipients of a kind of racial repatriated reparation. So there's a deep racialism which is being propounded through the racialization of the law in South Africa, which is completely antithetical to the value of non-racialism in the Constitution. So non-racialism in the Constitution is culturally threatened, is pragmatically undermined by the imposition of a racial caste system that is built on racial quotas. And culture can't help but imbibe and reflect and propagate the kind of indulgence in experiencing the secondary toxic effects of this racial caste system. So, for example, there was a headline in a paper that said that at university, white students get higher marks at university. Now, mathematically, this is to be expected. Without even looking at any further data, one can just assume that there wouldn't be any discrepancy between white students and black students or white students and non-white students if you actually had colorblind admissions that didn't have quotas or racial profiling as part of the admission criteria. But because you do have a quota system on admissions to universities, it's obvious that one group is going to be more competitive than the other group, and therefore the average of one group is going to be higher than the average of that of another group, whichever group is being hampered by the racial segregation in admissions. If you remove the racial segregation in admissions and had colorblind admissions, then there wouldn't be any secondary segregated effects, because you wouldn't have any primary segregated input, So the racial segregation which is being imposed on admissions is having a racially segregated output or consequence. This is baked in because of the initial imposition imposed on the system. I mean, I've already basically spelled it out, that the real problem is that the imposition of a racial caste system has toxic secondary racial segregated consequences. And then when we look at those secondary consequences, it encourages people even more to lean into a kind of racialist discourse and a racial consciousness, instead of realizing that the impetus and the instigation of racialism through the racialist law is the ground zero, is the proximate harm, and it's direct constitutional harm. It's essentially a kind of propaganda for war against the Constitution. It's anti-constitutional propaganda, which has been propagated by judges from the bench. Judges who should not be on the bench, but who should be impeached if we had a functioning democracy. But instead, it's more like the democracy has infiltrated the judiciary and made it dysfunctional. So we have a defunct judiciary. We live in a South African constitutional crisis, and no one politically acknowledges this, especially the media, because we have professionals all over the place who do not have any deep ownership. They don't have any deep, authentic belonging in their profession, because their credentials have been undermined by the racial caste system. So when we removed meritocracy and created this perverse incentive for people to develop a racial consciousness as a reaction to needing to justify the removal of meritocracy, we have created a disgusting secondary industry of black intelligentsia propagating justifications for preferential treatment on the basis of an imposed racial caste system. So we're stuck with the culture of a racial caste system right now in South Africa. We have lost the rainbow nation. We have lost the liberal order. We no longer live under a liberal order. We no longer live in an open society. We live in a racial caste system. And this needs to be reversed. Everything else is a symptom of this moral corruption. This is the moral corruption that facilitates and disguises or gives a disguise to state corruption and tender, lucrative tenders being awarded to people for no value other than the fact that according to the law, they are a representative of their race. They are a representative of their group. So there's this kind of tokenism built into the law, which then is being culturally recycled or culturally repackaged as a kind of race nationalist, sort of Nazi conspiracy theory that confirms and justifies the use of tokenism. It's really quite strange because, it somewhat inflates black billionaires with previously disadvantaged via the label previously disadvantaged. You have to believe in this myth of this common oppression that is affecting black billionaires and affecting the marginalized poor who are also previously disadvantaged. So somehow, previously disadvantaged becomes this glue that holds together a coalition which is basically propagating everything. Their whole worldview is based on this kind of racial animosity and racial resentment and racialized hatred, essentially, to cover over the fact that the black political elite are using the poor as a human shield in order to facilitate their corruption. And this level of corruption and this level of political recycling of grievance into scapegoating is a fascistic, sort of cultural machine, is a fascistic mechanism that was all facilitated by racializing the law. It was facilitated by corrupt judges who betrayed the constitutional revolution and who must be punished accordingly. I would even argue, and I mean this, I'm putting on my legal cap now, and I'm just going to give my legal 2 cents in it. I think that we should use Section 36 properly and calculate that these judges don't just deserve to be imprisoned for their constitutional damages and their anti-constitutional propaganda that they have allowed into society from the bench, but because they have facilitated this war on our Constitution, they are deserving of death. They should be executed, I think. I think the right to life is importantly is justifiably limited in the cases where a judge, especially a constitutional court judge, has betrayed the Constitution so directly and so overtly. So, when a judge does things that are impeachable, but then when they also do things that threaten the life and the culture of the Rainbow Nation, where they have actually destroyed the culture of the Rainbow Nation, and this is an ongoing effect of the racialized law which they continually allow and which they have facilitated through their ideologically corrupt judgments. These people have treated society and have also fundamentally impinged on the fundamental dignity of individuals. So these are people who have deprived people of their fundamental dignity by not properly using Section 36 when examining the question of whether racialized policy is justifiable or not. They completely subverted and they failed to go through the test of Section 36, which is necessary. The lettered subclauses in Section 36 is a legal test that must always be performed when a right is being limited. And the failure of judges to follow that basic principle of the rule of law and constitutional supremacy, they have struck down constitutional supremacy, and there must be consequences for the destruction of constitutional supremacy in South Africa. So, okay, here ends that tangent. So that would be my argument for these judges to be executed for treason against the Constitution. That these judges are actually guilty of treason against the Constitution, which is the highest form of betrayal. And they have put us in a position where South Africa is a hypocrite relative to 1994. To the 1994 revolution, the democratic revolution of 1994, these judges have failed that dispensation and killed it, in fact. Now the question is, we as a South African people, can we resurrect it? Can we bring back the Rainbow Nation? Can we bring back the South African Constitution? Can we recognize the crisis and put it right? And that is, if there is going to be a true national dialogue, that is my diagnosis, and that is the necessary prescription required in order to fix the problem. And if you don't go that deep and you don't attend to the issue on that level, you haven't gone far enough, and we're just going to be living out more symptoms of the same constitutional crisis. So that is my submission to the South African national dialogue. Fix the constitutional crisis.